one of my big questions was, why did spirit speak to me and tell me to bring my arm in that saved my arm, but did tell me to wake up and save my children? And over time, I began to realize that that this was part of our life plan to have gone through this experience. But there really are no words to describe how excruciatingly painful that whole situation was. I mean, as soon as the car stopped rolling and and I came to and my eyesight came back, I realized that our life had changed forever.
Welcome, Julie. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Laura.
You're welcome. I I heard that you've gone through quite a heartbreaking but yet profound experience. Can you give us a little bit about your background and take us through the experience?
Yeah, yeah. Well, currently I work as a spiritual medium, and my experience actually brought me to this space where I do that work. But yeah, my background, growing up, I was what you might call very fundamental Christian, very strictly religious, that type of upbringing. And then I went through some pretty major losses. I lost my brother to suicide, and then a couple years after that, my first marriage ended in divorce. I had three small children. I remarried not too long after my divorce, and we had three more children. So my husband and I were raising six children together. And in 2007, I was driving across the country from where we lived in Houston, Texas at the time. I was driving east with my three youngest children. My three oldest children stayed at home. They had work obligations and other school obligations and so forth, but I had my three youngest children with me and we were traveling. And as I was driving east across the country, I suddenly fell asleep at the wheel of the car. And I had never felt tired that day as I was driving, but it was the middle of the afternoon and I woke up and I was bouncing in the grass in between the eastbound and westbound lanes of highway. And when I tried to pull my vehicle back up on the highway, obviously in shock that I was where I was, when I tried to pull the vehicle back up on the highway, we started rolling. The wheels just lifted off the ground and we began to roll. And interestingly, as we began to roll, I heard a voice in my head, very calm, very patient, say, bring your arm in. And somehow I had the presence of mind to bring my arm in. And so I did. But I was knocked out as the car was rolling. And as I came to, everything was black. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear my 12-year-old son who had been sitting in the seat next to me. And so I knew he was in the car and at least alive because it was such a serious accident. We rolled across two lanes of highway into the grass on the other side of the highway. And so I could hear him. But when I started calling for my daughter, Carrie, who was 10, and my son, David, who was 8, who were in the back seat as we were driving, there was no answer. And as my eyesight came back, I just saw all the destruction in the car. And I began to just scream, I killed my kids. I killed my kids. I killed my kids. I mean, it was excruciatingly awful. And as I looked, I saw that they had been thrown from the car, and they were what felt like to me at that point being physically and emotionally, stunned and in shock. It felt like they were a football field away from us. I really, to this day, it's still hard for me to understand how because it really, even in my mind's eye now, when I look at them, they're like so far away. And it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but that's what I saw. And I wasn't in a position to be able to get to them. And I did find out later that day that they had passed away. And so, one of my big questions was, why did spirit speak to me and tell me to bring my arm in that saved my arm, but did tell me to wake up and save my children. And over time, I began to realize that they were, that this was part of our life plan to have gone through this experience. But it was, oh, there really are no words to describe how excruciatingly painful that whole situation was. I mean, as soon as the car stopped rolling and and I came to and my eyesight came back, I I realized that our life had changed forever. And I had experiences that day that some of which came back in memories as I kind of replayed the day. And, um, one of which was having this experience of actually leaving my body during the accident and rising above the accident with them and having an opportunity to say goodbye. I couldn't tell you what we said. All I can tell you is that it felt very, very peaceful and calm, and which doesn't make a lot of sense, but there was a knowing in that experience that what had happened had been planned to, in whatever way our humanness has trouble wrapping our head around that. Um, I also had a memory of going above, beyond the accident into a council where I convened with a council for a time, but I have no memories of what was said or what was discussed. All I can remember, all I brought back from those experiences and even the voice in my head that told me to bring my arm in was just immense peace. One, one, one thing that happened when I was in the hospital was we were taken by ambulance. My older son and I were taken by ambulance to one hospital. My younger children were taken to a different hospital. So I laid in the hospital on a striker board, those boards they strap you to when they don't know
Mhm.
exactly the extent of your injuries, and had taken me to the hospital. And I was laying on this very uncomfortable striker board, and all the chaos of an emergency room, the buzzing, the beeping, the voices, it was an emergency room. And I would and I was in complete panic myself, and just between crying and, I mean, I was in complete panic. It's the only word I can think to describe it. But I would have these moments where I would feel like I was being taken, they were almost like out of body experiences where I was taken out of the hospital room and brought into this space with Jesus, who I now call Yeshua, to distinguish from the Jesus that I knew in Christianity versus the Jesus that I know personally, as the master that he is. And he would, I was out of my body standing there with him in a field of flowers with distant mountains in the background, and he just held my hands and stared into my eyes and just brought me so much love and peace. Today, it's kind of hard to, that memory never left me. That memory was vivid from the moment that it happened, but it was hard for me to wrap my head around everything that had happened. And so I really, really suffered for about 3 years, from the death of my children. I was homeschooling, and they were a big, 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 big part of my life, as they would be for any mom.
Mhm. Yeah.
And it was excruciatingly painful. And I felt so responsible. I was buried under my guilt, my shame, my grief, and there's no escaping. It's not like there was some person that was victimizing me and I could just leave the room and leave them in another room. Like, everywhere I went, I went. And so I couldn't get away. I was the victim and the victimizer. I was all of the above. And it was um, unimaginably painful. And I went through 3 years of therapy. I mean, really two and a half because it was a few months before I started therapy. But I went through months and months of therapy, EMDR, trying to get over my PTSD, my um, complicated grief, all of the struggles that I was going through. And then at about the 3 year mark, things were getting worse instead of better. Honestly, at that point, early on, I had this, and as a grief specialist, I often, share with people that like early in your grief, it's like that's all there is. It's just you're just living in the grief, and you just let go of any other responsibilities you have, and you do like the absolute minimum to take care of yourself, to take care of your house, to take care of anything else. Like grief is your job. But over time, you start to re-enter life, and then the heaviness of that grief just becomes so overwhelming and so hard to integrate into the everyday life. And that what I call the messy middle, when we start to shame ourselves and say, I should be doing better, and why am I not doing better than I am, and why can't I figure this out, and so on and so forth. And so all those messages were going through my head, and I was burying myself alive. Like it was the darkness that I felt was really overwhelming, was very, very overwhelming. I had tried some medications even at one point, and they sent me into not a good place. I didn't
Mm.
respond well to medication. Actually, thankfully, I'm glad. I mean, that's just me, but my body is very sensitive to medications, and so that didn't go well for me. But about the 3 year mark, I found myself in London out of the blue in an unexpected trip, and we ended up taking a side trip. My husband and my one of my daughters was with us as well, and we went to Stonehenge. And later, I learned that Stonehenge is often considered the heart chakra of the earth. And what a better place, like it just brings tears to my eyes to even think about it. What a better place for a mom whose heart is broken to end
Mm.
up. Um, it's really, really striking me so deeply today. And about a week later at my church, they offered a special prayer for me, and within 24 hours of that, like I felt healed. I was like, it was like before the accident, I was asleep. I died when my kids died, and then I woke up 3 years later to this spiritual awakening that was profound and remarkable. And it was a couple of years after that I began to receive messages, very, very distinct messages that I needed to share my experience and I needed to help others. And I had no idea what that looked like. I honestly, Laura, I resisted that message completely. And I can remember, you have these memories where you can remember exactly where you were and what you were doing. And I can remember I would wake up in the morning and this thought would be in my head that I need to share my message. And I can remember laying there in my bed, like, and thinking, that's crazy. Who would want to hear my story and hear my experiences? And yeah, it was a couple years after that. So about 5 years after the accident, I was introduced to a man who had overcome some big challenges in his own life, and he was sharing these experiences with us at lunch. And during this lunch, my mom had introduced me to him and his wife. And during lunch, my mom said, Julie, share your story, tell them your story. And I was like, like I can't share my story. And but I did, very haltingly and not really knowing what words to use, but very briefly I shared my story. And as we were walking out of the restaurant that day, that man grabbed my arm, just took my arm and he said, "You're supposed to do something with this." And when
Oh,
he said that, it was like a lightning bolt struck me. It was like I couldn't deny his words. I couldn't deny the what I felt in that moment. And so that began my journey of seriously considering how I could share my story. And then that took me on another journey of a couple of years of, experimenting with some different things and trying to figure out what that might look like.
wow. Yeah, it's not easy losing anyone, let alone, children. And you did say it was on Mother's Day as well?
It was Mother's Day, 2007. I don't think I even mentioned the year, but this all happened on Mother's Day. It actually happened to be my birthday weekend as well.
Oh my gosh.
My birthday was that Saturday and the next day was Mother's Day and we were traveling on Mother's Day. And because of my Christian upbringing, there was a big part of me that started to create this story in my grief, in my shame and my guilt and so forth, started to create this story that God was punishing me and that's why this had happened. Which when we look, and I've just shared a bitty piece of some of the miracles that happened in on the day of the accident, but there were things that happened before, there were things that happened after, where heaven, divine influence was trying to send a message to me that this was, in fact, part of our plan. I'll share a couple with you. 6 months after the accident, I walked into a drugstore and I saw these costumes they were putting out for Halloween. And I saw this one costume and I immediately thought of my daughter, Carrie, and how much she would love that costume. But then the grief just, ooh, pummeled me. I mean, it just like came in a quarter of a second after the thought that she would love that costume because my humanness was still trying to adjust to
Mm,
the idea that they weren't here. And when that happened in my head, I said, why did this have to happen? And I heard in my head that peaceful voice again that said, they're right where they're supposed to be. And then when I heard that answer, because I heard it very distinctly, because I answered back to it. And in my head, I said, but why did it have to happen this way? Why did I have to be the one driving the car? Why am I carrying all this burden for what's happened? And the voice answered again and said, how would you have liked it to happen? And there's
wow.
no good answer to that question. No good answer. Um, I realized my brain, especially in that moment, clicked through a lot of different options, which is what our brain does when we ask questions. It starts clicking through options, and there just was no good answer to that question.
Mm,
And then
yeah.
about a year after that, my boys, so my two oldest daughters at this point had left for college, and then I had a 15 and a 12-year-old at home. By this time, they were probably 16 and 13. I mean, teenagers, like the worst time in a person's life, that transition from childhood to adulthood. And I remember one day just again in my head going, why they're growing up in such a different household than my girls grew up in. I thought this is just not fair to them. And that voice again came to me and said, this is part of their experience too. And so I realized in that moment, this wasn't just about me. It was like everybody that this experience touched and continues to touch was a part of this experience. It wasn't about me. It was about my whole family. It was about their friends. It was about our friends. It was about, the clients and the people that I've worked with since. It really is, just even in this moment, they're bringing into me like how universal this experience was and how many people this has rippled out to touch.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting how like spirit brings I get those too. It's like redirect on my thinking or my thoughts. And same with what you were saying, like how would you have wanted it? They intercept these things for me, and as I'm going through my experiences, so I understand how, that can help you to shift the consciousness around that and then kind of think of different ways to think about it. And it may help ease it, a little bit to look at it from a different perspective, but doesn't always take away the grief. I think always the grief, uh, the missing the heart, especially with children, is always going to be there.
Yeah.
It does help though. I understand too, because with knowing what I know from my near-death experience and my channelings, uh, you know, it's more massive than what we think. We think it's only like this big, right? And it's all about we're in our human self, but we don't realize the whole spectrum where it ripples out and helps and affects other people because then we can help other people through what we've been through.
Yeah, for
And
sure. And I've seen it, and it's interesting because I often think we need new language around grief because the grief that I experience, I don't consider this is really hard for people to understand. We just passed the 19th anniversary of this accident, and it's hard for people to understand, but I don't experience grief from their loss anymore. I've come to understand that they were meant to be here 10 and 8 years. They were only going to be here for a short time. They actually had an accident when they were 3 and 5, where they both fell out the second story window together. They had been leaning on the screen and fell out the window together onto our pool deck with minor injuries.
uh,
And David literally had no injuries, and Carrie had minor fracture to both of her wrists, so she wore two casts for a month. But that's pretty minor injuries for falling out a second story window onto a hard surface. And that was an exit point. That was I think, a sign to us that this was part of their path, and they could have gone when they were 3 and 5.
mhm,
But they stayed for another 5 years, and I'm so grateful they did. But I also recognize that I had a choice. I mean, I believe in the life plan. I believe that we planned our experiences before we came, which again, that was part of that experience of going with them. And I didn't remember that immediately. That memory came back later. And I think a lot of the reason that memory came back later is because I don't think it would have made any sense to me at all if I had had that experience at the moment, or if I'd even remembered it. Remembering this experience with Yeshua and some other things, it's really interesting to see how the different pieces have fallen into place.
mhm,
But I had to come to terms with the fact that before I came here, I had a choice. I could be their mom for 8 and 10 years, or I could not have been their mom. I mean, really, that's the choice. So, a lot of times people will think, and it's not that I don't do that. I do that. I think of my kids now and I think, oh, they'd be 29 and 27 now, right? Um, and and I do think of that on occasion, but it's not like I sit around thinking, oh my gosh, what would it look like? I don't dwell on that at all because they were never meant to be here that long. And so it's hard to explain, but this is the way that I have come to understand it and have come to terms with it. And so I don't experience a lot of grief. I experience a lot of connection. And
mhm.
I think my spiritual connection with them has really allowed me to continue that relationship on the other side.
Yeah. Yeah, because I feel I'm on, the same page with you, about the pre-life planning, and things like that, our exit points. And I think when we have that perspective and we're in alignment with that, we have a better connection with them on the other side because we're not in the illusion anymore. We're not in the suffering, we're not in the grieving, but it also unfolds the way it's supposed to, right?
Yeah.
And probably why you didn't get it when you probably might have thought you would have gotten it before and you had gotten it later, the information. Because, and maybe you signed up for experiencing the grief, going into that,
Oh, for sure. For
and that was
sure,
part of yours.
because my path began as a grief coach. I started as a grief specialist and working with people who were grieving and developing my program and actually experiencing Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And I don't know if you're familiar with who she is, but she's the person that, people when you think of palliative care, or you think of hospice, or you think of the 5 stages of grief, those are all things that came out of Dr. Kubler-Ross's work. And as I was developing my program, I felt her near, and I thought, this is, I had a hard time understanding what that meant. But I think, in our humanness, we're like, oh, who am I to have somebody that people know show up and help? But of course they're here. Of course they're here helping. Of course she's interested in seeing the continuation of the work that she did and seeing it continue to develop in newer and to grow, to mature, her work to mature past just the 5 stages of grief. And yeah, it's been remarkable and having these different experiences, learning to communicate with them. And then as I was doing the grief work, I would be working with clients and I would literally hear their loved ones in my ear telling me things and actually helping me in the session. In fact, I absolutely knew on several occasions that it was only because of the other side, it was only because of heaven or divine intervention that the client even found me. People would
Mm.
say, early on, people would say, I found you on Google. I'm like, that's not even possible. I mean, I'm not going to show up on Google. I'm brand new. Nobody knows who I am, right? And so it was a remarkable experience. But I didn't know in those early days how to communicate to people. Hey, your son's here. This is what he's sharing. I didn't know how to do that. Also, I was afraid of it because of my religious programming. I was a little afraid of it, even though it felt totally natural and felt very peaceful and the work itself felt so sacred, the work that I was doing. And then one day in 2020, it was just after my first book had come out, Miracles in the Darkness. And in that book, I never even mentioned angels, channeling, any of this, like spirit communication. I don't think yeah, I think the only time I mentioned angels in that book was I after the accident happened and seeing the kids in the field. I remember just seeing all these people there with them, and I realized much later those weren't people. His spirit, said, scan your memory, scan your visual of your memory. There were no cars on the side of the road. Like, there was like 1 or 2 cars. All those people couldn't have come from 1 or 2 cars. And so I think that's probably the only place I mentioned it. But in 2020, just after my book had come out, I was running errands. I'm getting in my car in a parking lot. And as I'm getting in my car, I feel this young man with me. And it's my friend's son who had just passed away 2 weeks before. And I I was like, I just knew he was there. It was just this sense of knowing this, it was clear sentience, which is that sense of knowing, and it was clear cognizant, that knowing of who it was. And I didn't know exactly what to do with that. So I did the only thing I could think of, and I pulled out my phone and just started typing into my phone the message that I was receiving. And so that's what I did. And eventually I did deliver that to his mom. And and it started to develop from there. Then I had an experience where I learned later this was my daughter, who's passed, Carrie, who was sending me 12s everywhere. And I was one of these people, math was my favorite subject. I had thought about, majoring in engineering. I mean, that's how much I loved math. Um, I was the homeschool mom that every kid and every mom called because they're like, we're having trouble with our math homework. How do I do this? And so I was very linear in my thinking. And so I struggled with the idea that, oh, there's signs or there's this or there's that. Like I was spiritually open, but I was also very skeptical. But it got to the point where the 12s were everywhere and I couldn't ignore them anymore. And so I started asking anybody I knew that had any knowledge around this, like, what does this mean? And eventually I just realized that they were waking me up. And 12s, the reason 12 is significant is that's my birthday is the
Mm.
12th. And so they, yeah, so they, especially my daughter Carrie, she's the one that communicated to me that she was kind of behind the whole 12 thing. In fact, this past about a week and a half ago, or I guess it was a week ago, my two oldest daughters and I went to New York on a girls' trip, and 12s everywhere. When I woke up in the morning, my plane was delayed, and it said on my app that I was going to arrive in New York at 12:12. And I snapped a picture, like 12s everywhere. I looked up at this building and it was 12:12. Like the number, every time I looked at my phone, there were 12 messages. And I thought that was so beautiful on the first day of our girls' trip that my youngest daughter sent all these 12s. But these 12s woke me up to the angelic realm. And a few months later, I was in Mexico on a whale watching trip. It was not going well. We weren't really seeing anything, and I thought, this is going to be a dud. And I was kind of grumpy, and the boat was uncomfortable, and finally, um, I was just like, I was just in this grumpy mood, and there was no getting me out of it until I heard in my head that peaceful, calm voice once again came to me and said, Julie, you have angels. And when I heard that, my energy lifted, my frequency lifted. It was just like from here to there in an instant. I wish I could remember to do that all the time. Julie, you have like I can remind myself. They don't always have to be in my ear, right? Like I can do that for myself. Um but I heard that voice, you have angels, and I started saying in my head like a mantra, thank you for bringing the boat close to the whales. Thank you for bringing the whales close to the boat. And within 10 minutes, we were surrounded by whales. We had
Wow.
whales on our left, and then we had them on our right, and then they came up to our right front, and then we had a whole pod of dolphins swimming next. I mean, it was a show. And I was in the best word I've found to describe it is bliss. Like, it was just pure bliss, this ocean of whales just dancing and playing around us. It was incredible. And after, quite a while of this show, our excursion guide said it's time to get back to shore. We've been out here, we're at the end of our tour. We need to go back. This has been amazing, but we've got to go back. And when he said that, the whale started to drift off, and one came up and lifted his tail and slapped the water like he was waving goodbye, and then swam off.
Wow.
And it
Beautiful.
was beautiful. And it was the next day that I received a very distinct message, Julie, go home and start teaching about angels. And so I did. I went home and started teaching about angels and connecting with angels and started channeling and all kinds of things I had no idea I had an ability to do. And
Mhm.
studying mediumship and learning how to deliver the messages that I was receiving. And yeah, it's been beautiful.
Beautiful. Yeah, and I think a lot of times we just forget we have angels, we have help from the other side. I know I do sometimes. especially when we're kind of like not in that high vibe. We got life going on, it's hard to remember, oh yeah, I have angels, and they
Yeah.
can help,
Yeah.
Um, and like for me, numerology comes in too. Like recently, it's been in the last few days, fives and ones. And I'm like, okay, what does that mean? So I'm looking it up, because I don't really get into the numerology, but yeah, like today, and it's been ones today. So from 5 5 1 5 1 5 5 5 to 5 1, now 1 1 1. And I'm like, okay, something's going on, there's some kind of alignment happening. But yeah, we forget to call on, the extra help that we have, the angels and
Yeah. And they have so many ways of getting our attention. And and sometimes when I use the term angels, I'm also it's not only it's our angels, it's our spirit guides, it's our loved ones on the other side, and they're sending us messages through all types of things. We may hear a song, or we may wake up with a song lyric running through our head that feels significant, and we, pay attention to the lyrics that's there, and what does it mean to you, and animals, they speak to me through animals a lot of the time. One day I live on a very country roads out in Tennessee, south of Nashville, and one night I was driving home on this windy country road out here, and this raccoon ran into the middle of the road. No, I didn't hit it. He left before. I just want to say that up front. But he ran into the middle of the road, turned and looked at me like straight on, like where you see the white eyes because of the headlights, and then turned and left. And I thought, okay, what does that mean? The other day, this was just a couple weeks ago, I was on my back deck and this robin, and we have lots of birds in our backyard, but this particular robin flew up into the tree. And then I was looking at it, and because of the way the light was, excuse me, I couldn't tell exactly what type of bird it was, but then it flew to another part of the tree where I could see that it was a robin, and it felt significant for some reason. And I thought, maybe that's a message for me. So that's it's what catches your attention. It's not like all day, every day, oh, this robin wrote that robin, that it was in that moment, that robin was further away, flew closer so I could see what it was, sat right there, and when I looked it up, it was exactly the message that I needed to hear. So I have a book on my phone about animal spirits and their meaning, and so I'll just look it up. Or if it's a number, you can look up angel number 111, or you can trying to think of some other things, crystals. I had an occasion one time, and you're going to think I'm on a cruise all the time because when we went whale watching, we were cruising, but I was on a cruise, a different cruise, and I had, the straw hats that you put on your head to shade,
yeah.
and I would go up on the deck and I'd wear my straw hat, and then I would take it off and I would roll it up and put it in to my backpack, like point down. And then I would take my backpack back to my room and I'd set it in the room and go about my business. The next day, I would get my backpack out, go back out to the deck, put my straw hat on. Well, the next day, I pull out my straw hat and there's a crystal in my hat. I
Oh,
have no idea how it got there. But when things like that happen, it catches my attention. And I look it up and I go, okay, what is this all about? And I don't get overly, this is another thing I would just suggest is I don't get overly concerned about like what the message is. A lot of times I feel like when I see a lot of 12s or I see the 111s or the 333s and things like that, sometimes I'll feel drawn to look up what it means, especially with spirit animals for whatever reason. I always feel drawn to look up what it means. And sometimes I just feel like they're just winking, like they're saying hi. They're just reminding me that they're there and to ask them for help. Like I have to be reminded to ask for help because I don't always remember. I
Mhm.
try to remember, but like you said, we're going about our life, and I do, have a practice where most mornings I'll get up and I'll, have a moment of meditation, and then I'll do some channeling and I'll receive very direct messages. So during the day when I see things, I'm not always looking up what it means, but I would say I think a lot of times, that's funny. I've never thought of it this way. Um, they gave me the term spiritual constipation. I'm like, what does that mean? But that's what they put in my head. We get a little, uptight about our spirituality and are we doing enough and are we catching the messages? And I think really if we relax into it and we just have fun with it and we enjoy it and we make that effort to connect without expectations of what it's going to look like. I've shared a lot of stories today. Like every day isn't a day of pulling a crystal out of my hat. Those
Yeah.
are unusual situations, but I have gotten in the habit of noticing the angelic realm around me. And one of the ways that I did that was a few years ago, I had a note on my phone, and every day I would just write the date and I would write down every number, animal, any other sign, music. Music is a big one for me. Images, anything that showed up that just felt like it was maybe a message or a wink or you can call it a God wink or an angel wink or, yeah. And so I started recording those, and that made a big difference in my awareness. So I always advise people to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes I think it's just, you're right on track or, just very simple things,
Yeah.
they're acknowledging you or they're confirming or whatever the case may be. It's just very simple when I see those. And kind of with the messages, you said you got a message to bring your arm in. Um, was there a reason for that? Like, would something have happened if you didn't bring your arm in or?
Yes, thanks for mentioning that because it was about 3 months later when my uncle called and he said, I just saw a woman on TV who lost her arm in a rollover car accident. That could have been you.
Mm.
And it was in that moment that I was like, oh yeah, that could have been me. But I heard a voice in my head that told me to bring my arm in. And a couple years after that, I met another woman who had lost her arm in a rollover accident just like mine. And um, you can look at that and you can say, okay, so why didn't that voice wake me up? Because my experience was not to lose my arm. My experience was it was the time that my children were to pass. And so I didn't need the additional, that wasn't part of my experience, I'll just say. Yeah, I think so. I mean, like I said, they were only supposed to be here 8 and 10 years, but losing my arm just wasn't a part of that additional. I can't even imagine, and I personally know people who have been in car accidents, who have lost multiple people in their family, and have also gone through immense physical injuries because of their accident. And for whatever reason, that wasn't part of my path. Another thing that happened on the day of that accident was my 12-year-old son, who had been in the front seat, he had a pretty significant injury to his right leg. And the doctor who actually developed the procedure that he needed was there at the hospital that day. And I can remember the attendants, the nurses, in the hospital saying, what is he doing here? I mean, it was a Sunday, it was a holiday. They were surprised he was there. But he was such an angel, like he was an earth angel to our family because he not only he not only did the procedure for our son that saved his leg, and his leg is completely healthy today. He's able to run and do all the things, right? He's a 30-year-old man now. But he but this doctor was also advocated for our family and actually was very helpful in helping us navigate the hospital system and get home because we needed to have a funeral and various things that needed to happen at that point. We were in the hospital for a few days because our son needed to recover to a certain extent before we could return home.
Yeah, yeah. Now, was there a point where you had to go through like self-forgiveness in
Oh,
your healing?
100%. Yeah. And early on, even telling this story, even suggesting that like I said, we need new language around grief because we can have occasional sadness, but I don't really think of that as grief. And I don't, yeah. I mean, at this point in my journey, I don't really even experience, I guess, occasionally I have, some sadness um, when I see somebody else's sadness about them having passed or something, but we need new language around that, and we need to expand our thought process because yeah, that was so much of my pain. I was beating myself up so badly, and there was in fact, at the minute that I came to in that accident, and the minute my eyesight returned, and I saw all the destruction, and I knew my life had changed forever, I was desperately trying to figure out how to reverse time. That sounds crazy, but I like desperately trying to figure out how to reverse time. Like, how can I go back 30 seconds? 30 seconds would have changed everything. But there's no such thing as going back and changing those 30 seconds. But this is, I'm glad you brought this up because it brings me to this concept that they've been teaching me more about more recently. And it's the concept of time. Time and space on the other side is very different than it is here. And a lot of times when I'm teaching people about spirit communication, how to connect with their loved ones on the other side, we get hung up thinking that if our loved one is communicating with us, then we're taking them away from something else, or and really it's so different on the other side. Like you're in Florida and I'm in Tennessee, and I'm in Tennessee, so I can't be in Florida. But in reality, like here we are on a call, right?
In the moment.
And we're recording this right now, and it's going to live somewhere, and somebody's going to come back and listen to it 5 years from now, and it's still going to be there. So, what they've been showing me is time is less like a timeline, forward and backward, and more like a pond. And we are in the present moment, and that's all there is. And everything that we do in this present moment is like a drip into that pond that ripples out. So if you had asked me about my accident a month afterwards, I would have told it totally differently than I did today. Or in 2012, when I was asked to tell about my story, I told it totally differently than I do today because of all the healing that I've done. And because of all the healing that I've done, it has changed my yesterday. The circumstances, the larger picture remains the same. My reaction to it, my interaction with it, my integration of it has changed tremendously. Like it's crazy to think that, something like 15 years after the accident, when I learned that Stonehenge was considered a chakra of the earth. Like I had no idea. That was
Yeah.
something that was completely foreign to me at the time. And then I learned that, and it became a part of my experience in that moment. So in that moment, that ripple. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I understand like the concept, there's no time. And the way they give it to me is it's more like um it's kind of like, okay, this happens and this happens and this happens. It's not like a timeline because nothing can happen unless something happens prior to it. And then when we heal, what they said is we're also not only just healing this present moment, but we're healing the past and the future.
Right,
Does that make
exactly.
sense?
Which is what I mean by the pond is like what's happening in this moment. This healing is healing forward and backward. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's beautiful. And we make bigger impacts, I guess is a good word for it. It's always hard to find very good verbiage, more than what we know,
Yeah.
when we do certain things in life and the choices that we pick. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Because often I feel like I wish I could do more to impact people. I wish I could do more to share with people that they don't have to live with grief, especially parents who lose children. I was kind of lucky in that all this happened just before Facebook became a thing. And a few years ago when it's been almost close to 10 years ago now, when I first started this journey of grief work and then moving into the spiritual realm of it. But I was looking at the resources that are available to people. And unfortunately, what I found was all these very large Facebook groups for parents who have lost children. I'm talking 250,000 people on them, where the author, the person, that's running this site is just feeding this constant drip of you're going to hurt for the rest of your life, you're going to hurt for the rest of your life, you're going to hurt. And I didn't have that concept. So I had lost my brother to suicide 17 years before. And I remember a couple weeks after the accident sitting in my backyard and thinking, I I somehow came back after the loss of my brother. I somehow came back after a really, really painful divorce that happened a couple years after my brother died. And I remember sitting there thinking, is it possible to come back from this? But that hope was alive in me. I didn't have the constant drip of, you're going to hurt for the rest of your life, you're going to hurt for the rest of your life. So now what happens for parents is they get this constant drip of, yeah, this is going to hurt the rest of your life. And they get it from parents who've lost children many years before because they've been fed that. And it just continues this ripple of you're going to hurt for the rest of your life, which it does not have to be that way. We can we can learn to communicate with them. We can learn to overcome the challenges. In fact, I lost my brother to suicide, and I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of times when I do readings, people who have died by suicide often come through. And the overwhelming message I receive is their loved one is sitting there just feeling so bad that they didn't do something to keep them here. But the overwhelming message I receive over and over and over again is they wouldn't have been here as long as they were if it hadn't been for that loved one. That loved one kept them here longer than they probably would have been here if it hadn't been for their love, for that love and that support that they received. But they were in a lot of pain. It really didn't have to do with their family and friends as much as it was just their pain was so overwhelming and it couldn't be overcome.
Right. Yeah. And I've had some interactions with people who are teaching, in those groups that you're talking about, as grief counselors, things like that. And it's like I try to give like a different perspective on it, and they're like, well, you can never heal from this. And they just kind of went on a rant. And I'm like, I'm so sorry, that you wouldn't be open to have the experience of transforming, or having it, looking at it from a different perspective, and it wasn't, they didn't really appreciate
Yeah,
the guidance that I offered. Some people just aren't open to it,
it's true.
in whatever case. And maybe it's just they're meant to just linger in the suffering, and to until they're ready to come out of it.
Yeah. I don't know if you're familiar with the organization called Helping Parents Heal.
Hmm.
But Elizabeth and her group, and she shared her story on my podcast, well, gosh, a year or so ago, and talked about like that shared death experience that she had with her son and how she went to support groups. And in the support group, she was trying to share because she wasn't experiencing grief like the other people were because she had this shared death experience. Similar to me having this shared death experience that I had with my kids, but I didn't recall it,
Hmm.
immediately. But she had this experience that just brought like she went into the light with him. And so she would go into these support groups and try to share this because she wanted people to hear this. And she'd be pulled aside by group leaders saying, sorry, we don't talk about that in this group.
Oh,
And
that's a
that's
shame.
why she started helping parents heal, is because she couldn't find groups that were willing to acknowledge her spiritual experience or even allow her to share it. So they do beautiful work helping people connect with their kids on the other
Yeah,
side.
beautiful. Yeah. Um, I love that she started. Sometimes you have to start a new way, if people aren't willing to be open.
Yeah.
We'll just put it that way. So definitely. Um, is there any other topics that you think would be very helpful for the audience that are watching today?
Any other process? Which
Topics or
topic?
anything? Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that one of the things I always share is this idea of believing your spiritual experiences. So even we don't need validation from others to believe the experiences that we've had. And I think we're all kind of looking for that validation in every sense of what that means. And we can find validation for our experiences in various ways, but look for that within. The times when I've gone through transitions, when I left religion a few years ago, I went into this transition of, what do I still believe versus what was I conditioned to believe? And as I was going through that transition, there was moments within that transition where I was like, it's all made up. And I was just like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I'm just like, everything's made up. And I can only believe what's right in front of my eyes, which is not true. I mean, we look at our skin, but we know that there's more going on underneath there. My skin isn't what allows me to raise my arm.
Hmm.
There's so much more going on in the world than what meets our eye. So I went through this transition for a little bit where I was like, I don't know what I believe. And I think I just needed to kind of reject it all for a minute to see how really bleak my world was. When I did that, I was really, really unhappy. I was really unhappy. I didn't feel like myself. I didn't, and I realized this is this is not helping anybody for me to reject everything that has been validated for me over and over again. Maybe not by an outside source, but by an inside source
Hmm.
and by the things that I've experienced and the ongoing validations of those experiences, like the robin in my backyard, for heaven's sakes. And then looking up the meaning of that, and it was exactly the message I needed. Now, we can call that what we want to call it, but I'm choosing to call that spirit guidance, spirit calling my attention to the bird, or spirit, commandeering that bird to bring it closer to me so I could see exactly what it was. Um, there's a quote, actually, I have it right here on my computer because I wrote it down and I stuck it to my computer from Albert Einstein that says there are only two ways to live your life. One is as though nothing is a miracle, the other is as though everything is a miracle.
Beautiful.
And and I choose to consider everything as a miracle and everything has its purpose. And there's a reason that we met today, Laura. There's a reason that I'm here. There's a reason that you're here. That's one of the things that happened after the accident because, after my healing experience, I went through some other valleys of healing. Like we're always going through these cycles. It's not like we're whew, like this. It's like this, right? It's like these cycles. And if we choose to continue that route of um, taking on more and understanding more, then we're going to cycle up like that. And one of the things that I I've totally lost my train of thought. But there was a reason I started saying that, so I'm going to think about what it is real quick.
All right. Um, well, and I like the way that you talk about the validation because as you're talking about, and I'm like, isn't that interesting how we look for validation to step out of the box?
Yeah,
On different things. And okay, it's almost like we're peeking our head outside, but then it's like nobody's accepting, so we close the door again. And we have to, I think that's how we evolve, we grow, we transform, we
yeah.
new experiences. We have to stop getting validation, even in grief or suffering or whatever we're going through, and just go forward.
It's so true. And I remembered what I was going to say, and that was after the accident, I remember realizing, and after I'd gone through this healing experience, I thought, there's a reason I'm still here.
Mhm.
I mean, I could have totally died in that accident, just like my kids did, but I didn't. So I had to get real with myself. Like, why am I still here? I have a purpose here. I have a reason for being here. And even if it's just to be the wife to my husband, the mother to my children that are here, um, you know, we all are here for a reason.
Mhm.
Every single person.
Yeah, I ask myself that too. I'm like, because I had a near-death experience. I had a lot of experiences. Part of me is like, I want to go home. I don't want to be here anymore. And I'm like, well, I'm here for a reason, obviously. It's like, okay, why am I still here? You
Exactly.
know, so definitely. Now you have a different take on Jesus. You call him
Hmm.
now Jeshua. Is it Weshua? How do you pronounce that?
Yeshua.
Yeshua.
Hmm.
What about source? How do you see source, and has that perspective changed for you?
Oh, absolutely. Because the Christian religion in which I was raised very much saw God, source, as a man, the kind of the grandpa with the beard type. Um, and I see source very differently now, as more of and it's hard to define for me. I don't know that I can define it, but it's just this love that I can't even comprehend. It's the love, it's the peace, it's the joy, it's the presence that I can't even comprehend. In fact, as I woke up this morning, I was remembering a time when I woke up and I had this presence of peace that was different than I had ever experienced before. And it was tangible. Like it felt like a presence, not just, oh, I'm at peace. It was like a presence.
Hmm.
It was quite profound. On my daughter's birthday this last year, I had a really remarkable kind of near-death-like experience where I was communicating with her. I had the house to myself. My husband was traveling that weekend, and I was communicating with her, and she brought me back into her childhood. And it was almost like a life review where she brought me back to memories I had forgotten about, and like this whole thing. And there was so much love and forgiveness and compassion for who I was during that time. And it was so beautiful, so incredibly beautiful. And then later that day, I had decided to go to a movie, and I was driving to the movie theater. It was late afternoon, early evening, and I look up and there's a beautiful angel in the sky. The sun was here, and then two clouds that just like wings.
Mhm.
And similar to what is behind you right now with the sun in the middle and the, clouds on each side. And then I got to the theater and I'm sitting in the movie theater waiting for the movie to start. I realized I'm in theater 12. And I thought, wow, what a beautiful. So you see how like I could have reached out to someone and said, I think I just had this experience with my daughter and she brought back these memories and looking for that outside validation, but I received this internal validation by seeing the angel, by noticing that I was in theater 12. Like all of this validated itself in a beautiful way.
Beautiful. And then lastly here, if somebody wanted to connect with their children that's passed, what would be the easiest and best way for them to do
One of the ways that I've found to connect is to write notes. You write a letter and then you just listen for the answer. And so I would say, Dear David, and write him a little note, and then say, Dear Mom, and then listen and have him respond. And I don't do it often. I do it occasionally. I feel them around when I feel them around. I acknowledge the presence of my guides, my angels, my loved ones. Um, but I have work to do here. They have work to do there. And we are synergistic in that experience. So it's just if, you can talk to them out loud, you can have their picture there, just know that they're hearing you, that they're knowing what's going on in your life. That comes through so often where they'll bring up something that just happened or something like that. Yeah.
Oh, beautiful. And I'm sorry, I just got another question.
Okay.
Um, now, some people might say, well, if we keep the communication with them, like we're holding them up on the other side, we're not letting them go. They're not moving on, we're holding them here. What is your
Yeah.
thought on
And I've heard that too. And you know, in all of the communication I've had with my kids, with people's loved ones, as I've communicated as a medium, I haven't had that message. co- I shouldn't say I haven't had that message come through. I did once have I do think that when we communicate with them, when we're when we're in grief, it's very hard to communicate because the grief is like a shield between us and the other side. Like it keeps us in a lower vibration. And the way we connect is raising our vibration. You'll notice when I heard, you have angels, it's like my vibration went up, so they lower their vibration, I raise mine, and we're able to communicate. In grief, it's harder to communicate because we're in this lower vibration. Um, if and that's why in our humanness, we need to grieve. Grief is part of the healing process. But we're not meant to, and that's why I say we need new words around this because we're not meant to grieve forever and ever. We're meant to have a period of grief where our system, physically, things move physically a lot slower than they move spiritually or they move emotionally. Things can move emotionally like that, spiritually like that. But physically, we need more time to create something molecular, right? So, we need that time for grief, and it is part of the healing process, but we don't need to stay there forever. So if we're grieving forever and ever and ever, and we think that's where we're supposed to be, and I don't say that to put any shame on anybody who's grieving. If you're grieving, grieve. But also allow yourself to have those moments of joy. A lot of times when people are grieving and something joyful happens and they smile and then I can't smile because they feel like they're not honoring the person, but you are. When you smile, you're honoring the person. They're here with you, trying to help you and guide you. They are, they're happy for you to be happy. So it's a more complex question than maybe I can answer in just a few minutes, but um, allow yourself to feel joy, allow yourself to grieve, allow yourself to move through the emotions. Emotions are energy in motion. Allow the energy to move. What's good for the body is good for the process, all those things.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, it can go in a little in depth with that. So because I can see where you're going with it, and they kind of just brought in that question. So, all right. So if somebody did need help navigating death, the loss, grieving, whatever they're going through, how would they connect with you?
You can go to juliecluff.com. I have a few different appointment options there. And I do a podcast called Light the Day. I channel messages from the angels. I post on Instagram and Facebook and YouTube. But yeah, on my website, juliecluff.com, I have a couple of options. I have a mediumship option, which is allowing people to connect with their loved ones, and I have a spiritual guidance session where we connect with their guides and receive impact. A lot of times those two appointments kind of start looking a little similar, but yeah,
Yeah,
whatever calls your name, do
all
it.
right. Beautiful. Well, thank you, Julie, for joining me today. It was a great conversation.
Thank you so much, Laura. It was a pleasure.
You're welcome.